The phone rang at 6:32 in the morning. I knew the exact time because I was already awake, just lying there, staring at the digital clock and thinking about my schedule for the day. Even 3 years after retiring, I still woke up early. 39 years of teaching at Crown High School had taught me that morning was the most valuable time of the day. When I picked up the phone, it sounded like a stranger's voice. It was broken and gasping. It took me a few seconds to realize it was my son's voice. "Mom, Dad died, heart attack." I suppose the normal reaction would have been to scream or cry. But the only thing I felt was a strange numbness. It was as if the news was about a character in a book I had once read to my students, not my husband. "Can you hear me?" Vance's voice sounded irritated. "Dad's gone." "Yes, I can hear you," I finally replied. "Where did it happen?" "In the garage. He was working late. Priscilla found him this morning." Of course, Priscilla. His sister was always there for him, even in his final moments. Unlike me. "I'll be right there," I said, already getting out of bed. I was 67, but my movements were still quick and precise. My body remembered decades of teaching discipline. "Don't bother," Vance snapped. "Priscilla is already taking care of everything. We'll call you later." And he hung up. I stood there in the middle of the bedroom with the phone in my hand. Lawrence was dead. My husband of 43 years was dead. I automatically went to the bathroom, turned on the water, and looked at my reflection. Gray hair pulled back into a bun for the night. Wrinkles around my eyes, not from laughter like some women my age, but from constantly squinting over books and students' notebooks. I looked exactly the same as I had yesterday. But the world had changed. The water ran into the sink, and I stared at it, remembering how I met Lawrence. The year was 1981. I had just started working at the school, full of enthusiasm and ideas. My car broke down on the way to work, and I was late for my first lesson ever. Lawrence's auto repair shop was the closest one, and he personally towed my clunker to the garage and then drove me to school in his pickup truck, which smelled of motor oil and tobacco. "Marry me," he said 3 months after we met. It wasn't a romantic proposal, more like a business proposition. He already knew what he wanted: his own business, a family, a home. And I was in love with his confidence and strength, with the hands that could take apart and reassemble an engine with his eyes closed, with the directness with which he spoke about his plans. I turned off the water and started getting dressed. A dark blue dress that I wore to my students' graduation parties. Strict, but not mournful. I didn't have any special clothes for such occasions. I never thought Lawrence would die first. He always seemed so eternal. Contrary to Vance's advice, I decided to go. Not to the garage. The police and paramedics would surely be there by now. To our shared house where Lawrence had lived since we separated 3 years ago. The same house we had paid the mortgage on for 30 years, including my teacher's salary. I remembered the day I brought home my first paycheck for the down payment on the house. Lawrence took the envelope with the money and tossed it carelessly on the table. "That's not enough," he said. "You need to think about the kids, not your job. Odette is starting school soon, and Vance needs new shoes." I remember how I kept quiet then. Although inside I was boiling with indignation. It was a good salary for a beginning teacher. And I wasn't just working. I was teaching children to love literature, to understand the world through the words of great writers. It was my calling. But to Lawrence and his family, my profession was always something insignificant. "You just read books to children," he would say when I stayed late checking essays. "Big deal," Priscilla would snort when I was awarded Teacher of the Year. The car didn't start right away. It was an old Ford I got after we split up. Lawrence kept the new SUV for himself. "I need a reliable car for work," he said at the time. As if my job didn't require reliability. It took 20 minutes to drive to our former home. When I pulled up, there were already several cars at the gate. Priscilla's car, a shiny black Lexus, took center stage. Vance's Chevrolet and my daughter Odette's beat-up Hyundai were parked nearby. The whole family was there except me. I took a deep breath before getting out of the car. Mixed feelings were swirling inside me. Grief over the loss of the man I had spent most of my life with. Nervousness about meeting his family, who had never accepted me. A strange sense of relief that I would no longer have to try to live up to his expectations. Odette opened the door. My daughter, so much like her father, The same square jaw, the same cold gray eyes. She was wearing a black dress and her makeup was perfect, as if she had been preparing for this day. Mom, her eyebrows rose. What are you doing here? My husband died, I replied simply. Where is he? He's been taken to the morgue. Aunt Priscilla is taking care of the paperwork. Of course, Priscilla. Ever reliable Priscilla, who always knew the right thing to do, who never let me forget that I married Lawrence only because he was too kind to turn away a poor teacher with a broken car. I walked past my daughter into the house that had once been mine. Nothing had changed. The same family photos on the walls, although my portraits gradually disappeared with each passing year. The same sofa where we sat in the evenings with books. Me with classics for tomorrow's lesson, Lawrence with auto parts catalogs. Everyone had gathered in the living room. Vance paced nervously from corner to corner, his wife Martha crying quietly on the sofa. Their son, my grandson Fletcher, sat in the corner with a book, the only one who had inherited my love of reading. And Priscilla, the center of this universe of grief, giving instructions over the phone. No, only white lilies. Lawrence couldn't stand roses. Yes, an oak coffin, the best. The ceremony is on Thursday at noon. She saw me and froze for a second, then she quickly finished her conversation. Eleanor, she never called me Nora like everyone else. Vance said he called you. Yes. He said Lawrence had died. I tried to keep my voice steady, like in class when I was explaining a difficult topic to unruly teenagers. I came to help with the funeral arrangements. Priscilla put the phone down on the table with such a bang that Martha flinched. There's no need. We've already decided everything. Without me? I looked at my son, then at my daughter. I'm still his wife. We're not divorced. You've been living apart for 3 years, Mom, Vance interjected. Dad wouldn't want you to… What? He wouldn't want me to be at his funeral? I felt a familiar wave of indignation rising, the same one I had suppressed for decades for the sake of family peace. Exactly, Priscilla cut in. Lawrence was very upset when you left. I didn't leave. My voice remained calm, though inside I was seething. He kicked me out when I said I wanted to travel after retirement instead of sitting at home baking pies for his clients. That doesn't matter. Priscilla moved closer to me. She smelled of expensive perfume and power. What matters is that you haven't been part of his life for the last 3 years, and now you have no place at his funeral. I looked back at my children for support. Odette looked away. Vance stared at the floor. Only Fletcher looked at me. Seriously and intently, the way children do when adults behave strangely. This is my husband, I said quietly, the father of my children, the man I've lived with for 43 years. You're nobody here, Priscilla said, enunciating each word as if she were punctuating a long sentence. We don't want you at the funeral. You made your choice 3 years ago when you left him for your books. I felt my shoulders slump, a gesture of defeat that had become familiar to me over the long years of marriage. But something clicked inside me. It was as if the last page of a long, painful book had been turned. All right, I said, straightening up. If that's what the family wants, I won't come to the funeral. I turned to leave and caught Fletcher's eye. His eyes asked a question I didn't have an answer to. I smiled weakly at him and left the house I had once called home but had always felt was a stranger's. Thursday arrived as inexorably as every day since Lawrence's death. I woke up long before dawn and sat in the kitchen of my rented apartment for a long time, staring out the window at the empty street. The funeral was scheduled for noon. There were 6 hours and 43 minutes left. I had no intention of going. The promise I had made to Priscilla carried weight. Not out of respect for her, but out of respect for myself. I always kept my word. A professional habit of a teacher who cannot deceive her students if she wants their respect. And yet, part of me refused to accept that I would never see Lawrence again, that our story would end like this, with a phone call and a humiliating expulsion from the family circle. The cup of coffee was growing cold in my hands. I remembered how Lawrence always drank his coffee scalding hot, quick, hurried sips, as if it were not a morning ritual, but a necessary fueling before a long day of work. Nora, you're too slow, he would say, watching me cautiously try the drink. Life passes you by while you blow on your coffee. At 10:15, Odette called. Mom, you haven't changed your mind? Her voice sounded tense, as if she were preparing for another conflict. No, dear. I promised I wouldn't come to the ceremony, and I'll keep my word. There was a silence. I could almost see her covering the receiver with her hand and telling someone, probably Priscilla, that everything was fine, that her mother wouldn't cause any trouble. Okay, she finally said. It's the right decision, Mom. Maybe, I said, looking at the photograph on the kitchen table. It was Lawrence and me on our wedding day, young and full of hope. Send him flowers for me. White lilies. I know he loved them. You don't have to, Odette began. I'm his wife. My voice sounded firmer than I intended. And I'll remain his wife, even if you all prefer to think otherwise. She sighed. I'll give him the flowers, she said after a pause and hung up. I sat staring at the phone in my hand. I wonder, I thought, if Odette realizes how much she's like her aunt. The same tone, the same intonation, the same way of making me feel insignificant. I remembered how Priscilla had reacted when I received the Teacher of the Year award in 2003. We were at a family dinner and I dared to mention the ceremony. Oh, Priscilla said, barely glancing at me. How nice. You got a certificate for telling kids about books you read in school. Then she turned to Lawrence. By the way, did you hear that Bradley from the bank approved the loan for the expansion? Now you can buy new equipment. And the conversation instantly switched to his business. My success was just a brief pause before the real, serious stuff. At 11:40, I got in the car. Not to go to the funeral. I had no intention of breaking my promise. But sitting at home imagining everyone saying goodbye to Lawrence without me was more than I could bear. The cemetery was located on the western outskirts of Corona. It was where all the respected citizens of the town were buried, including my parents. I parked on a side street with a view of the chapel and part of the cemetery. From there, I could see the crowd without being seen. I saw black cars slowly approaching the gate, people in dark clothes getting out of the cars, a priest greeting the procession, and a coffin, dark, gleaming in the midday sun, carried by 6 men. Among them, I recognized Vance and 2 mechanics from Lawrence's auto repair shop. It was a strange feeling to watch my own husband's funeral as if I were a stranger. It was like watching a movie about someone else's life that happened to be mine. My thoughts returned to the day I first brought Lawrence to school. It was a school dance for teachers and their partners. I had been teaching for 2 years, and my colleagues were finally starting to accept me as an equal. Principal Hawkins praised my success with difficult teenagers whom I had managed to get interested in literature. Lawrence looked out of place in his only suit all evening. He remained silent while the other teachers discussed books and teaching methods. And when the principal asked him what he thought of my approach to teaching, Lawrence just shrugged. Nora loves her books, he said then. As long as she manages to cook dinner and take care of the kids, I don't care what she does at school. I remember the awkward silence that followed his words, and the embarrassed glances of my colleagues, and how I explained afterwards. He's just joking. Lawrence is very proud of my work. Although I knew that wasn't true. For him, my profession had always been a hobby that I devoted too much time to. I was jolted out of my memories by the sound of the phone. It was Vance. Where are you? He asked without saying hello. At home, I lied. How's the ceremony going? Everything's fine. His voice sounded tense. Fletcher asked about you. I told him you weren't feeling well. Thanks for protecting my reputation. I couldn't resist the sarcasm. Mom, don't start, Vance sighed. We're all trying to do our best. For whom, Vance? For me, for your father, or for Priscilla? He paused. For all of us. Families need to stick together in difficult times. And you exclude your own mother from the family? You excluded yourself when you left your father. The old argument. As if I had decided to leave, and not Lawrence who kicked me out when I dared to announce my retirement plans. I'm not going to argue with you on the day of your father's funeral, I said after a pause. Call me when the ceremony is over. I hung up without waiting for a response. My gaze returned to the procession. They were already approaching what would presumably be Lawrence's grave. I saw Priscilla, tall and straight, dressed in a strict black suit that seemed to have been designed for such occasions. She stood with dignity, accepting condolences from everyone who approached her. A true head of the family. Next to her stood my children, Vance with his phone to his ear, talking to me, and Odette, holding her 13-year-old daughter Melanie by the arm. A little to the side was Fletcher, my 17-year-old grandson, tall and thin, with a book in his hand. He even came to the funeral with a book. It made me smile through the tears that finally began to flow down my cheeks. I watched as the coffin was lowered, as the first handfuls of earth were thrown, as people slowly dispersed, leaving only the closest friends and family at the fresh grave. And all the while, I felt like a ghost, an invisible observer of my own life. When it was all over and the last cars had left the cemetery, I finally got out of mine. On unsteady legs, I walked to the place where Lawrence now lay. The earth was fresh, the flowers bright against the dark soil. Among them, I noticed a bouquet of white lilies. Odette had given them to me after all. "Goodbye," I whispered, looking at the temporary plaque with his name on it. "I hope you found peace." I didn't cry. All the tears had already been shed, not today, but over the long years of our life together. Years when I gradually disappeared, becoming a shadow behind him. When my every achievement was judged solely in terms of how it affected his comfort. I remembered how in 2010 I was invited to speak at an educational conference in New York. It was a great honor to represent our school and share my experience with colleagues from across the country. I was so proud of this invitation and told Lawrence with great excitement, "New York? For a whole week?" He didn't even try to hide his irritation. "Who's going to cook for the client reception? I was counting on your pies." "Lawrence, this is an important conference," I tried to explain. "I was chosen from hundreds of teachers." "So what?" He looked at me with genuine incomprehension. "You want to abandon your family for some book talk?" That time, I gave in. I canceled the conference. I baked pies for his clients. And I caught a sympathetic glance from Director Hawkins when I explained why I couldn't go. "Family circumstances," I said then. It sounded better than the truth. After standing by the grave for a while longer, I turned to leave and froze. A few feet away from me, at the cemetery gate, stood Fletcher. He noticed me and raised his hand in greeting. Then he looked around as if checking to see if anyone was watching and quickly walked toward me. "Grandma," he hugged me tightly, and I smelled his cologne, too mature for a 17-year-old boy. "I knew you'd come." "I didn't go to the ceremony," I said, pulling away. "I just wanted to say goodbye in my own way." Fletcher nodded as if he understood. Maybe he really did. Of all my grandchildren, he was the only one who inherited my love of books and quiet observation. We often talked about literature when he came to see me after school. On days when Vance was late from work and his wife Martha was busy with the younger children. "I ran away from the wake," he admitted, glancing at his watch. "I have half an hour before they notice." "Why?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "I wanted to make sure you were okay. It's not right that they didn't let you go to the funeral." I felt a lump rise in my throat, not from grief over Lawrence, but from the unexpected support of this boy who had risked incurring the wrath of his entire family for me. "I'm fine," I said, squeezing his hand gently. "Really, sometimes goodbyes don't happen the way we plan." Fletcher looked at the grave, then back at me. "Your grandfather loved you," he said quietly, "even if he didn't show it." I wanted to say that love shouldn't hurt, that true love sees and accepts another person completely, not just the parts that are convenient. But instead, I just nodded. "You know," Fletcher continued, "I found your book in his room, the one you mentioned, Jane Eyre. It was on his bedside table, with a bookmark in it." This news surprised me. Lawrence never read classic literature. He considered it a waste of time. "Why read made-up stories when there are so many real problems out there?" he would say. Jane Eyre was my favorite book, one I reread every year and often discussed with my students. "Maybe he started reading it after we broke up," I suggested, not knowing what else to say. "Maybe," Fletcher shrugged. "Anyway, I wanted you to know." He glanced at his watch again. "I have to get back. Aunt Priscilla is having a memorial service at Grandpa's house. All the neighbors and customers from the auto shop are there." "Go," I nudged him. "I don't want you to get in trouble because of me." Fletcher hesitated, as if he wanted to say something else. Then he quickly hugged me and walked toward the gate. Halfway there, he turned around. "I'll come by tomorrow after school," he called out, "if it's okay." "Of course it's okay," I replied. "I'll bake your favorite apple pie." He smiled and waved. I watched him walk away, a tall, slightly awkward teenager with a book in his hand. My small victory in this family that had never really been mine. On the second day after the funeral, life returned to normal as much as it could. I checked the tests of my former students, whom I sometimes tutored, prepared lunch, and tried not to think about Lawrence lying in his fresh grave. Not that I expected any calls from the children. They rarely called even on holidays. But for some reason, their silence felt especially heavy right now. Towards evening, the doorbell rang. It was a courier with an envelope. A plain white envelope with my name written in familiar angular handwriting. I immediately recognized the hand of Quentin Morrow, the family lawyer and an old friend of Lawrence's from school. "Mrs. Finch?" asked the courier, a middle-aged man with tired eyes. "Sign here, please." I signed and took the envelope. It was thin, with a single sheet of paper inside. I knew what it was before I even opened it. Lawrence's will, or rather, a notification that I was not included in it. In the kitchen, I made some tea, a little ritual that always helped me get through difficult moments. An old habit left over from the days when I used to check my students' essays at night when the house was finally quiet. A cup of strong tea, silence, and work that required concentration. That was my way of finding peace. Finally, taking a deep breath, I opened the envelope. Inside was indeed a single sheet of paper with the official letterhead of the law firm Morrow and Partners. I expected to see a long text listing assets, property, and instructions on who would get what. Instead, there were only a few lines printed on the page. "We hereby notify you that, in accordance with the last will and testament of Lawrence Emmett Finch, dated March 23, 2023, the main provision regarding all of the deceased's property is as follows. If she is not here, do not proceed. The official reading of the will take place at the office of Attorney Quentin Morrow 7 days after the funeral. Sincerely, Quentin Morrow." I reread that strange phrase several times. If she's not around, don't start anything. What did that mean? Who was she? Me, Priscilla, or someone else? I put the sheet of paper aside and looked out the window. It was starting to rain outside, a light, drizzling rain typical of the Crown at this time of year. The drops slowly ran down the glass, merging into streams. How strange, I thought, that at the most important moments in life, nature continues its usual course. Rain falls, wind blows, time passes, regardless of our tragedies and secrets. The phone rang. Odette's name lit up on the screen. "Mom?" Her voice sounded tense. "Did you get it? The will?" "If you mean the one mysterious line, then yes," I replied, looking at the sheet in front of me. "What the hell does that mean?" She didn't try to hide her irritation. "If she's not around, is that about you?" "I don't know, Odette. I'm as puzzled as you are." "Aunt Priscilla is furious," she said after a pause. "She called the lawyer, but he refused to explain anything before the official reading." I imagined Priscilla talking to Quentin. She always thought she could control everyone around her, with money, connections, or simple intimidation. But Quentin was different. He and Lawrence had been friends since childhood, and I doubted that even Priscilla could make him violate his professional ethics. "When is the reading?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Thursday at 10 in the morning," Odette replied. "Will you come?" There was uncertainty in her voice. She clearly didn't know if she wanted me there. On the one hand, I could shed light on the mysterious phrase. On the other hand, my appearance could anger Priscilla even more. "I don't know, Odette. Was I invited?" "Yes, the lawyer insists that all family members be present, including you." I heard a hint of resentment in her voice. It was as if my status as a family member was something she personally disputed. "Then I'll come," I said simply. "Okay," she paused. "Mom, do you know what that phrase means?" "No," I replied honestly. Lawrence never discussed his financial affairs with me, especially in recent years. It was true. Even when we lived together, Lawrence always kept control of the money. I was given a household budget, an amount I could spend on food and household necessities. Everything else, bills, taxes, investments, was his domain. And Priscilla's, who had been doing the bookkeeping for the auto repair shop since it opened. "See you Thursday," Odette finally said and hung up. I looked again at the piece of paper with the mysterious phrase. Something about it seemed familiar, as if I had heard those words before. Maybe Lawrence had said it once, or was it a quote from a book? I couldn't remember. The next day, when I returned from the store, there was an unfamiliar car parked outside my building, a silver Mercedes, too luxurious for my modest neighborhood. Standing next to it, Leaning against the hood was Quentin Morrow. He hadn't changed much since we last met a few years ago. He was still the same tall man with a neat haircut and an attentive gaze. Only his wrinkles had deepened and his hair had turned gray. Eleanor, he straightened up when he saw me. I'm sorry for the unexpected visit. Quentin, I nodded, trying to hide my surprise. Has something happened? Can we talk inside? He looked around as if afraid someone might see us. I led him into the apartment and offered him tea. He declined, nervously adjusting his tie. I shouldn't be here, he began when we sat down in the living room. According to protocol, we only discuss the will at the official reading. But given the circumstances, I thought you should know something in advance. I waited without interrupting. Quentin was clearly nervous, which was unusual for a man of his profession and experience. Lawrence drew up a new will a few months before his death, he continued. He didn't tell me the details until the very end. He just brought me a sealed envelope and said it was his last will and testament. And what's in it? I asked when the pause lingered. I only opened it after he died, as instructed. Quentin ran his hand through his hair. And I was surprised. There's really only one sentence. If she's not there, don't start anything. What does that mean? It's a legal clause, he explained. A condition without which the will cannot be executed. And she, in this case, is you, Eleanor. I felt a chill run down my spine. Me? But why? Lawrence left additional instructions, Quentin said, taking an envelope from his jacket's inside pocket. This isn't part of the official will, but rather a personal letter to me as the executor. He asked that I show it to you before the official reading. He handed me the envelope. I opened it with trembling hands and began to read. Quentin, if you are reading this, then I am no longer here. I know this is unusual, but I have my reasons. Eleanor must be present at the reading of the will and at all subsequent meetings related to the distribution of my estate. Nothing should begin or continue without her. If my family tries to exclude her from the process, as I suspect they will, they need to be made very clear that until Nora is present, no one will receive anything. Not a penny, not a square inch of real estate. I know this will cause problems, but believe me, I have very good reasons for this decision. Everything will be explained at the reading of the will, if you follow my instructions exactly. Lawrence. I reread the letter twice, not believing my eyes. Why would Lawrence require my presence? We hadn't spoken in 3 years, except for rare cold phone calls about taxes or insurance. He never mentioned this to me, I said finally. I thought so. Quentin nodded. Lawrence often kept his plans to himself, even from those closest to him. What now? I handed him back the letter. Now you must attend the reading of the will, he said firmly, and all subsequent meetings related to the estate. Without you, the process simply won't move forward. Priscilla will be furious, I almost smiled, imagining her reaction. She's already furious. Quentin allowed himself a faint smile. She called me 3 times yesterday. She threatened to file a complaint with the Bar Association if I didn't explain the meaning of that phrase. And what did you say? What I'll say at the official reading. It's Lawrence's will, and I'm bound to carry it out. He stood up. I have to go. I've already broken several professional rules by coming to see you. I walked him to the door. Thank you, Quentin, I said, for the warning. You're welcome, he said, hesitating. You know, Eleanor, Lawrence talked about you a lot in the last few months. I don't know what happened between you, but I think he rethought a lot of things before he died. With that, he left, leaving me confused. Lawrence had been talking about me? What exactly? And why had he decided to tie his will to my presence? That evening, Vance called. From his tone, I knew immediately that the news had spread quickly. Mom, what's going on? He asked without preamble. Aunt Priscilla says you somehow forced Dad to change his will. Are you serious? I couldn't hide my surprise. Your father and I haven't spoken in 3 years. How do you think I could have made him do that? I don't know. Vance sounded confused. But that strange phrase, why would Dad write that? I have no idea, I replied honestly. We'll find out at the reading. Aunt Priscilla thinks it's some kind of trick. She's already consulted another lawyer about contesting the will. Of course, I thought. Priscilla would never accept a situation where she wasn't in control, especially when it came to money. On what grounds, I asked. Lawrence was of sound mind when he made his will. She says it can be contested because of the vagueness of the wording. Vance paused. Mom, I don't want this to turn into a legal battle. We've all just lost our dad. I suppressed the urge to remind him that it was they, not I, who had turned Lawrence's death into a family conflict by excluding me from the funeral. Instead, I said, I just want everything to be legal, Vance, like your father wanted. Okay, he sighed. See you Thursday. After talking to my son, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, trying to piece together the puzzle. Why did Lawrence insist on my presence? What was so important that he wanted to tell us that even after his death he was forcing the family to interact with me? My thoughts jumped from one thing to another. Maybe it was his twisted way of apologizing, or a last-ditch attempt to control the situation. Lawrence had always loved being the director of our family drama, putting everyone in their place. Even now, from beyond the grave, he seemed to be pulling the strings, forcing us all to act according to his script. I remembered our last serious conversation before we parted ways. It was after I retired. I had spent 39 years in school teaching teenagers the finer points of English literature, and now I could finally fulfill my dream of traveling and seeing the places I had read about all my life. I shared my plans enthusiastically, talking about Venice, Paris, London, and who's going to take care of the house? Lawrence interrupted me then. Who's going to cook dinner for the clients? Who's going to help with the paperwork? We can hire a housekeeper, I suggested. Now that I'm retired, we can afford it. Nora, he looked at me as if I were a foolish child. Do you seriously think that at your age it's time to start some kind of adventure? You're 64. It's time to enjoy the peace and quiet of home, not traipsing around the world's landmarks. But I've dreamed of seeing these places my whole life, I objected. I put it off my whole life. First for the children, then for your business. Now I can finally... What about me? His voice became harsh. I've worked my whole life too. And now that I can finally relax, you're going to leave me and go away? I didn't say I was leaving forever, I tried to explain. Just a few short trips a year. We can travel together. I'm not interested in your museums and theaters, he snapped. And I need a wife by my side, not somewhere on the other side of the world. The conversation ended with him silently leaving the room. A week later, he told me that I'd better find a place of my own if I was so eager for independence. I didn't think he was serious until I found out that he had already found an apartment for me to rent. And now, 3 years later, Lawrence was insisting from beyond the grave that I be present at all family matters. How ironic. Thursday morning dawned cold and clear. I put on the strict dark blue suit I wore to parent-teacher conferences and my pearl earrings, the only jewelry Lawrence had ever given me. Not for a special occasion, but just because. That was early in our marriage, when he still noticed the things I liked. Quentin's office was in the city center, in an old building with columns. When I got to the right floor, everyone was already gathered in the reception area. Priscilla was wearing a black suit with a string of pearls around her neck, an exact copy of mine, only larger and more expensive. Vance and his wife Martha, both tense and awkward. Odette, constantly checking her phone. And to my surprise, Fletcher. He was sitting apart from everyone else, with a book in his hands. When I entered, Priscilla instantly straightened up as if sensing a threat. Finally, she said instead of a greeting. We've been waiting for 15 minutes. The meeting was scheduled for 10, I replied calmly, glancing at my watch. It's now 9:55. Vance and Odette exchanged glances. Fletcher smiled slightly at me from behind his book. At exactly 10 o'clock, the office door opened and Quentin came out. Good morning, everyone, he said in an official tone. Please come in. We sat down around a large conference table. I deliberately chose a seat opposite Priscilla so I could see her reaction. Quentin remained standing, holding a folder of documents. We are gathered here to announce the last will and testament of Lawrence Emmett Finch, he began formally. Before I begin, I would like to point out that the will is in an unusual form, but it is legally valid. If by unusual form you mean one mysterious line, then yes, Priscilla interrupted. We all received these strange notices. Now we want to know what they mean. Quentin looked at her calmly. I was just about to explain, Mrs. Finch. Lawrence's will consists of 2 parts. The first is the phrase you all received. If she is not here, do not proceed. The second part is a detailed disposition of his property, which will only be activated if the condition specified in the first part is met. And what is that condition? Asked Odette. She, in this case, is Eleanor Finch. Quentin nodded in my direction. Lawrence clearly stated that the entire estate can only be distributed if his wife is present at all discussions and meetings related to the inheritance. Silence hung in the room. I felt the eyes of everyone present on me, from surprised, Martha, to openly angry, Priscilla. That's ridiculous, Priscilla finally said. They lived apart for 3 years. She practically abandoned him. Nevertheless, they remained legally married, Quentin calmly parried. And Lawrence's will is clear. No decision regarding the inheritance can be made or carried out without Eleanor's presence. I will contest that, Priscilla stood up abruptly. Lawrence was clearly not in his right mind when he wrote that, or under someone's influence. She shot me an accusing glance. You have the right to contest the will, Quentin replied. But I must warn you that I have all the evidence to prove that Lawrence was fully competent at the time the document was drawn up, and that he acted without any external pressure. We'll see about that, Priscilla said, gathering her bag. I've already consulted a lawyer. We'll file a petition to have the will declared invalid. Aunt Priscilla, maybe we should hear the other side first, Fletcher interjected unexpectedly. Find out what exactly Grandpa left before deciding what to do with it? Everyone turned to him in surprise. A 17-year-old boy daring to contradict Priscilla was a rare sight. Fletcher's right, Quentin agreed. Perhaps the second part of the will clarify Lawrence's motives. Priscilla slowly sank back into her chair, keeping her gaze fixed on me. All right, she said finally. Let's hear what else my brother came up with. A heavy silence hung in Quentin Morrow's office. I sat across from Priscilla, feeling her burning gaze on me. She always had a way of looking at people as if she could see right through them, a skill I had noticed in her from the first day we met. My children sat with their eyes downcast, as if ashamed of my very presence. Only Fletcher and Quentin looked calm. Now then, Quentin opened the thick folder in front of him. The second part of the will contains detailed instructions on the distribution of Lawrence Finch's estate. But before we get to that, there is a letter that he asked to be read in front of the whole family. He took out the envelope and carefully opened it. I noticed that the seal was intact. Quentin, true to his principles, had not looked at the contents beforehand. To my family, Quentin began reading. If you are listening to this, then I am no longer with you, and that means Nora is present at the reading as I requested. You are probably surprised by this condition, especially considering how our relationship has been in recent years, but there are things that need to be said and truths that need to be revealed. Quentin turned the page. I noticed Priscilla tense up, her fingers clenching the handle of her purse. I'll start with a confession I should have made many years ago. Finch and Sons Auto Service, which everyone considers my sole achievement, would never have existed without Nora. In 1983, when I was just dreaming of starting my own business, I had neither the means nor the opportunity to get a sufficient loan. Nora and I had been married for only 2 years. Vance was 1 year old, and banks were not eager to lend money to a mechanic with no collateral and no business history. I couldn't help but shudder. Lawrence had never publicly acknowledged this fact. Even in private, he rarely mentioned where the money to start his auto repair shop had come from. It was Nora who came up with the solution, Quentin continued reading. She took out a loan in her name, using as collateral the inheritance she had received from her parents, a small house on the outskirts of town. It was that money, $15,000 in 1983, that became the startup capital for a business that is now worth millions. I heard Odette take a sharp breath. Vance sat with a stony face, but his white knuckles betrayed his inner tension. What's more? Quentin turned another page. When the bank almost took the auto repair shop away 3 years later because of my financial miscalculations, it was Nora's teaching salary that saved the business. For 8 months, she gave all her earnings to pay off the debts and keep the shop afloat. We lived on the little money I brought home, and the rest went to save what everyone now considers my personal achievement. I lowered my eyes, not wanting to see my family's reaction. Those months were some of the hardest of our lives. Vance was 4. Odette had just been born. We scrimped and saved on everything from groceries to children's clothes. I remembered washing and altering Vance's old clothes for newborn Odette because we couldn't afford to buy new ones. Why didn't I ever talk about this before? Quentin continued reading the letter. Partly out of pride, partly because it was more convenient for my ego. It was easier to think of myself as the sole breadwinner and creator of our family's well-being. It was easier to think of Nora's job as something secondary, a hobby, rather than what it really was. A stable source of income and insurance against many of my risky decisions. Quentin paused and poured himself some water. The office was so quiet that I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Priscilla's gaze shifted from burning to icy. She stared straight ahead, as if unwilling to meet the eyes of anyone present. But the truth is, Quentin continued, without Nora, there would be no business, no home, no education for our children. Her teacher's salary, which we all so often disparaged at the dinner table, was the foundation on which our prosperity was built. And while I was expanding the business and taking risks, she provided stability for our family. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I had waited so many years for this acknowledgement. Not public gratitude, just an understanding that my contribution had mattered too. That my career had not been a waste of time, as Priscilla had often implied and Lawrence had echoed. Now, about why I insist that Nora be present at all discussions of the inheritance. Quentin turned to the next page. It's not just because she has a legal right as my wife, and it's not just because her contribution to our fortune has never been properly recognized. It's also because I know my family. Here Quentin paused and looked up at all of us before continuing. I know how you all felt about Nora, how I allowed you to treat her. With contempt, with disrespect, as a second-class citizen whose dreams and aspirations were insignificant compared to ours. I saw it for years and said nothing. Worse, I encouraged it. And that is my greatest mistake and shame. I looked up involuntarily and met Vance's gaze. He was the first to look away, staring down at the table. Odette fidgeted nervously with the bracelet on her wrist. Fletcher looked at me with a new understanding. So my last wish is this. Nothing from my estate can be distributed or used without Nora's consent and presence. No business, no house, no accounts, nothing. This is not revenge or an attempt to control you from beyond the grave. It is belated justice. Priscilla couldn't take it anymore and stood up, interrupting the reading. This is absurd! Her voice trembled with suppressed rage. Lawrence was out of his mind when he wrote this. This nonsense! Who would believe that the successful business he built over decades started with some teacher's loan? I have all the documents to back up Lawrence's words, Quentin replied calmly, taking several yellowed papers out of a folder. The original loan agreement from 1983 in the name of Eleanor Finch. Bank statements showing the transfer of funds to the auto repair shop's startup capital. Documents on the collateral of the property she inherited. He laid the papers out on the table in front of Priscilla. I also have financial reports for 1986, when the business was on the verge of bankruptcy, and statements from Eleanor's personal account showing how her salary was systematically used to pay off the auto repair shop's debts. Priscilla looked at the documents as if a poisonous snake had been placed in front of her. She slowly sank back into her chair. Even if that's true, she said after a pause, that was 40 years ago. Since then, the business has grown tenfold, and that growth is thanks to Lawrence, not some school teacher? I spoke up for the first time, and everyone turned to me. Is that what you meant, Priscilla? She pursed her lips but didn't answer. I never claimed credit for growing the business, I continued. Lawrence was a talented mechanic and entrepreneur. I always recognized that and was proud of him. All I wanted was the same recognition for my work, nothing more. Mom, Odette spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Why didn't you ever tell us about this? About the loan, about saving the business? Would you have believed me? I looked at my daughter. You, who cringed every time I mentioned school at dinner. Who was ashamed to bring friends home when I checked their school notebooks in the living room? Odette lowered her eyes. I knew my words had hurt her, but now was not the time for delicacy. I had been silent for too long, trying not to hurt their feelings, while no one cared about mine. There's something else, Quentin interrupted. Lawrence left this with instructions to give it directly to Eleanor, but he said she could share the contents with the family as she saw fit. He took a worn, leather-bound book out of the desk drawer. I recognized it immediately, the diary I had given Lawrence on our 20th wedding anniversary. He had laughed at the gift, saying, Nora, you know I'm not the type to write down my thoughts. I never imagined he had ever used it. This is Lawrence's personal diary, Quentin explained. handing me the book. He kept it for the last few years. He wrote in it a lot after you two separated. I took the diary, feeling its weight in my hands. It felt strange to hold something that contained the thoughts of a man with whom I had spent most of my life, but never really knew. We'll take a break, Quentin announced. Eleanor, you can read the diary in the next room. The rest of you can wait in the reception area. In an hour, we'll continue and move on to the details of the estate distribution. Everyone began to get up. I noticed Priscilla whisper something to Vance, and he nodded, glancing at me uncertainly. They were clearly planning some kind of strategy for how to proceed. But right now, I was more interested in the diary in my hands. Quentin led me into a small office with a comfortable armchair by the window. There was a carafe of water and cups on the table. I'll be in the next room if you need me, he said, leaving me alone with Lawrence's diary. I sat there for a while, not daring to open the book. It felt like an invasion of someone's privacy, even if they were dead. But Lawrence himself wanted me to read it. And maybe it had the answers to questions that had been tormenting me for years. Finally, I opened the diary. The first entry was dated March 20th, 2021, about 6 months after we broke up. The house feels empty without Nora. I never thought I'd miss the sound of pages turning, the smell of the tea she always drank in the evenings. Priscilla says I need to stop thinking about her, that I have to move on. But how can I move on from someone I've lived with for 40 years? I turned the page, feeling tears welling up in my throat. In the 3 years we had been apart, Lawrence had never said anything like that to me. Our rare phone conversations were always strictly practical. Bills, taxes, sometimes the children. The next entry was dated 2 weeks later. A woman came into the service station today, a teacher from Nora's school. She asked how she was doing. I didn't know what to say. I don't know how she's doing. We hardly ever talk. When she left, I sat in my office for a long time, remembering how Nora would light up when she talked about her students. I never understood her passion for teaching. I thought it was a whim, a waste of time. What a fool I was. I scrolled down. The entries became more and more candid, more and more painful. Vance talked about Mom with such contempt today that I raised my voice at him for the first time in my life. He looked at me like I was crazy, and I realized it was my fault. For years, I let the kids talk about her without respect. Worse, I set the example. How could they respect their mother when I, their father, devalued her every achievement? My hands trembled as I turned the pages. Entry after entry, Lawrence revealed a completely new side of himself to me. A man who realized his mistakes too late. A man tormented by regrets he never shared with me while he was alive. Priscilla keeps insisting that I change my will. She says Nora doesn't deserve anything after she abandoned me. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. That I was the one who pushed Nora away when she dared to express her desires. Desires she had put aside for 40 years for me and the children. My sister always had too much influence over me. Even now at 69, I fear her judgment. What a pathetic man I am. I wiped the tears streaming down my cheeks. All this time, I thought Lawrence hated me for leaving. That he thought I was a traitor, a selfish woman who abandoned him for her silly dreams, as he called them. I never would have thought he blamed himself for our breakup. The last entries were made very recently, just a few weeks before his death. Went to see Quentin today, changed my will. He thinks I'm crazy for writing it this way, but I know my family. I know they'll try to cut Nora out of everything just like they've done for years with my silent complicity. Not this time. Let this be my last gift to her. Recognition of her role in our lives, recognition that I put off for so long. And the last entry, dated just 3 days before his death. I called Nora today. I wanted to say so much, but we ended up just talking about home insurance. 43 years together, and I never learned how to talk about what really matters. Maybe after I die, she'll read this diary and understand that I realized my mistakes. That I regret how I let my family, Priscilla, the kids, even myself, treat her all these years. That despite everything, I loved her until the end. In my own clumsy way, unable to show it. But I loved her. I closed the diary, feeling strangely empty. So many years of resentment, so many years of feeling unappreciated. And finally, the confession I had waited so long for. But it came too late, when Lawrence was no longer alive. when I couldn't look him in the eye and tell him that I loved him too, despite everything. That part of me would always love the clumsy mechanic who gave me a ride to school on the day we met. A knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. It was Vance. "Mom," he entered uncertainly. "Can I come in?" I nodded, wiping away the traces of tears. "Did you read it?" He nodded at the diary in my hands. "Yes," I replied simply. Vance sat down across from me, his hands clenched nervously. "I talked to Odette," he began after a pause, "and we want to apologize for how we behaved at the funeral, and in general, for a lot of things." I looked at my son, a tall man of 42, so much like his father. The same strong chin, the same hands made for working with machinery, and the same fear of showing his true feelings. "You didn't know," I said softly. "Your father never told you how the business started, about my role in it." "But we should have guessed," Vance objected, "or at least wondered. Instead, we just accepted his version, that your work was a hobby, that he was the only one bringing home the bacon." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Fletcher told me something today. He said, 'You know, Dad, Grandma always asked about my grades, my interests, my friends, but you and Mom always asked if I cleaned my room and did my homework.' And he's right. You've always been genuinely interested in us. And we treated you like a servant." His words hit me with their honesty. I had never thought of it in those terms, but he was right. For years, I had felt invisible in my own family, except when it came to practical matters. "Thank you, Vance," I said quietly. "It means a lot to me to hear that from you." He nodded, still avoiding my gaze. "Aunt Priscilla still wants to contest the will," he said after a pause. "But Odette and I aren't going to support her. We think Dad was right. You deserve recognition and compensation for everything you've done for the family." "I'm not looking for compensation, Vance." I shook my head. "I just wanted my contribution to be recognized. For my work, my dreams, my desires to have the same value as yours." "I know." He finally looked me in the eyes. "And I'm sorry it took Dad's death for us to realize that." There was another knock at the door. This time it was Odette. She came in, and I saw that her eyes were red from crying too. "Time's almost up," she said. "Quentin wants to continue reading." I nodded and stood up, still holding Lawrence's diary. Vance stood up too. "Will you show us?" He nodded at the diary. "What's written in it?" I hesitated. On the one hand, those words were meant for me. On the other, they could help my children understand their father better. And perhaps me. "Yes," I decided, "but not today. I need time to think it through myself." They nodded understandingly, and we left the office together. The others were waiting for us in the reception area. Priscilla was sitting in the corner, talking quietly on the phone, probably with her lawyer. Fletcher was reading a book. Martha was nervously checking her phone. When we entered Quentin's office, I felt the atmosphere change. It was as if a heavy blanket of accusations and unspoken words that had hung over our family for years was slowly being lifted, allowing the fresh air of truth to enter. Rain was drumming on the roof when I returned to my apartment after reading the will. Soaked to the skin, I didn't even bother to change, just sat down in a chair by the window, watching the gray streaks running down the glass. Lawrence's diary lay on my lap, heavy as a tombstone. I was torn by conflicting emotions, relief at finally knowing the truth, bitterness that it had come too late, and a strange, unexpected sense of liberation. Lawrence's will came as a surprise to everyone. After Quentin read the letter and showed my contribution to the business, he moved on to the distribution of the estate. And then Priscilla almost fainted. "The Finch and Sons auto repair business shall pass in equal shares to my son Vance and my wife Eleanor, provided that Eleanor shall receive 50% of the profits, regardless of whether she takes an active part in the management," Quentin read. 50% of a business that was now worth several $1,000,000. A business that I had helped build with my money and my labor, but in which I had never been given any role. "The house in which I have lived for the past few years shall pass entirely to Eleanor, with Priscilla having the right to live there until Eleanor decides otherwise." It was our family home, which Lawrence and I had paid for with a mortgage for 30 years. The house I left 3 years ago, leaving it to Lawrence and Priscilla. My personal savings and investments are distributed as follows: 50% to Eleanor, 25% in equal shares to my children, Vance and Odette, and the remaining 25% to a trust fund for my grandchildren, to be distributed to them when they reach the age of 21. But the most unexpected was the last item. In addition, Eleanor shall receive full ownership of the land and commercial real estate located at 75 Riverside Avenue, which I purchased in 2015 and kept secret from my family. This property is currently leased and generates a monthly income of $8,000. I remembered how Priscilla first turned pale, then red, and then abruptly stood up and left the room, slamming the door behind her. Vance and Odette sat with their mouths open. No one, including me, knew about the existence of this property. Now, sitting in my small rented apartment, I realized the magnitude of what had happened. From a retired teacher with modest savings, I had suddenly become a wealthy woman. A woman who could finally fulfill her dreams. To travel, see the world, live the way she wanted without having to count every penny. But with that realization came another, more important one. I no longer wanted to be part of a family that had never truly appreciated me. I no longer wanted to try to earn the respect of people who had always treated me as a secondary character. Even now, when Vance and Odette had shown sudden remorse, I felt that it was largely due to shock at the will rather than genuine understanding. The decision didn't come easily. I spent several days rereading Lawrence's diary, talking to Quentin about the details of the inheritance, and considering my options. But with each passing hour, my conviction grew stronger. I needed to start a new life. Far away from Corona, far away from everything that tied me to the past. A week after reading the will, I arranged a meeting at my apartment for the whole family. They all came. Vance with his wife Martha, Odette with her husband Nate, Fletcher, and even Priscilla, though I hadn't expected her to show up. She was the last to enter, her head held high as if preparing for battle. "Thank you for coming," I began when everyone had settled into my cramped living room. "I invited you here to tell you about my decision and discuss some practical matters." I saw Vance and Odette exchange worried glances. Priscilla stared out the window with feigned indifference. "I've decided to leave Corona," I said bluntly, "to sell all the assets I inherited from Lawrence and start a new life somewhere else." "Mom," Odette leaned forward, "you don't have to leave. We can work things out. We understand now." "No, Odette," I stopped her gently. "It's not just about the will or recognizing my role in the business. It's about the 43 years I felt invisible in my own family." I looked at each of them in turn, lingering on their faces. "Have you ever asked me what I want? Have you ever been interested in my dreams, my achievements? To you, I've always been just a convenient appendage to your lives. The one who cooks dinner, does the laundry, helps with homework, but whose own desires don't matter." I saw Vance lower his head. Odette looked as if she were about to cry. Only Priscilla continued to stare out the window with a stony face. "You know what the saddest part is?" I continued. "I let this happen. I was so desperate to be a good wife and mother that I forgot to be myself. I suppressed my desires, my ambitions, my dreams because I was made to believe that they were less important than Lawrence's desires and ambitions and yours." "We didn't mean to," Vance began, but I raised my hand to stop him. "I know you didn't do it on purpose. You were just following your father's example and—" I looked at Priscilla, other influential members of the family. "But the result is the same. I've lived a life in which my worth was determined solely by how useful I was to others." Priscilla finally turned to me. "And now you've decided to get revenge," she said coldly, "to take everything and leave." "No, Priscilla," I shook my head. "I'm not getting revenge. I'm just finally doing what I should have done years ago, choosing myself and my freedom." I took several documents out of the folder and placed them on the coffee table. "These are my proposals regarding the inheritance. I am willing to sell my share in the auto repair shop to Vance at a fair market price to be determined by an independent appraiser. I'll also sell the house, but I'll give Priscilla 3 months to find a new place to live. As for the rest of the assets, I've already discussed everything with Quentin, and he'll prepare the necessary documents." "Are you really going to sell everything?" Vance asked incredulously. "Even the commercial property on Riverside?" "Everything," I confirmed. "I don't need these material ties to the past. I need freedom and the opportunity to finally live my life." "Where are you going?" Odette asked, her voice trembling. "I haven't decided yet," I replied honestly. "Maybe the East Coast or Europe. I've always dreamed of seeing Paris, Rome, Barcelona." "And you're just going to cut us out of your life?" Odette's voice sounded hurt. Your children, your grandchildren? I looked at her sadly. Odette, when was the last time you called me just to see how I was? Not to ask me to babysit or help with something, but just to talk? I saw her blush. You've all lived your lives in which there was very little room for me, and now I'm going to live mine, in which there may be little room for you. At least for a while. A heavy silence hung in the room. I felt a mixture of pain and relief at saying what I had kept inside for decades. As for the practical matters, I continued after a pause, all the documents will be ready by the end of the week. Quentin will remain my attorney and will represent my interests in all transactions. You can't just walk out like this. Priscilla finally turned to face me. You're part of this family, whether you like it or not. No, Priscilla, I shook my head. I've been part of this family for 43 years, and all that time I felt like a stranger. Now I'm choosing a different path. Mom, please, Vance looked confused. Let's at least try to fix things. We can start over. It's too late, Vance, I said softly but firmly. Some things can't be fixed. You can only accept them and move on. And that's what I'm doing. I saw Fletcher, who had been silent all this time, looking at me intently. His eyes showed an understanding that the others didn't have. I'd like to talk to Fletcher alone, I said. I think the rest of you understand. Vance wanted to say something, but Martha touched his arm and he held back. Odette looked as if she wanted to hug me, but didn't dare. Priscilla just got up and left without saying a word. The others followed her, casting uncertain glances at me. When Fletcher and I were alone, I sat down next to him on the sofa. You're not surprised by my decision, I said. No, he shook his head. I think I understand you better than they do. I've read the same books you have. I smiled. This boy, who was only 17, seemed wiser than his parents. Fletcher, I want you to know that my leaving has nothing to do with you. You're the only one in this family who has always seen me for who I really am. I know, Grandma, he said, taking my hand, and I'm happy for you. I really am. I took a small card out of my pocket. Here's my new email address and phone number. When you turn 18, you can contact me if you want. Maybe you'll even come visit. He took the card and carefully placed it in the book he was holding, a Dickens volume I had given him last Christmas. I'll definitely come, he said with confidence. And maybe even sooner than you think. We hugged and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. But they weren't tears of sadness, more of a strange relief and hope. Be yourself, Fletcher, I said, letting him go. Don't let anyone tell you who to be or what to love, even if it's hard. I'll try, he promised, and so will you. After he left, I sat in the silence of my apartment for a long time. A strange feeling of emptiness and fullness at the same time washed over me. I knew I had made the right decision, even though it was a painful one. I had finally chosen myself, for the first time in decades. The next few weeks were a blur. Quentin helped with the paperwork, appraisers determined the value of our assets, and realtors showed the house to potential buyers. I had almost no contact with my family, except for the occasional message from Fletcher and a few awkward phone calls from Odette, who was still trying to understand my decision. Priscilla found a new place much faster than I expected, in just 3 weeks. I guess she couldn't bear the thought of living in a house that now belonged to me. Vance agreed to all my terms for selling my share of the auto repair shop, although I could see it wasn't easy for him, not because of the money, but because he realized I was really leaving for good. And so, 2 months after reading the will, I stood at the airport with 2 suitcases and a one-way ticket. Everything that remained of my former life was packed in those suitcases. A few favorite books, photographs, Lawrence's diary, and a few mementos. I sold or gave away the rest. It's amazing how few material things turned out to be truly important. I didn't throw a farewell dinner or any kind of ceremony. I just wrote short letters to my children and sent them the day before I left. There were no accusations or bitterness in them, just an explanation of my decision and my wishes for their happiness. I didn't know if I would ever be able to truly forgive them or return to a normal relationship. But I knew for sure that I didn't want to carry the burden of resentment with me into my new life. The only person who knew the exact date of my departure was Fletcher. And he was the one who unexpectedly showed up at the airport just as I was about to board my flight. Grandma! He ran up to me out of breath. I thought I was too late. Fletcher? I looked at him in surprise. How did you know? I checked your email. He looked a little embarrassed. You left your computer on when I came to help you pack your books. I laughed, sincerely and heartily for the first time in a long time. You're impossible, I said, hugging him. And you should be at school. I'll be back for third period. He waved me off. This is more important. I wanted to make sure you were really leaving, that it wasn't just a threat to make everyone change their minds. No, Fletcher, I shook my head. It's not a threat, it's my decision, my new life. I know, he smiled, and I'm happy for you. I really am. We stood there looking at each other, and I saw wisdom beyond his years in his eyes. This boy understood what adults didn't, that sometimes leaving is not an act of weakness, but a sign of strength. I'll miss you, he said quietly. Me too, I replied. But remember, when you turn 18, I'll come, he promised, even if I have to cross the ocean. They announced boarding for my flight. I hugged my grandson one last time and headed for the exit without looking back. I knew that if I turned around, I might give in to doubt. And there should be no more doubt. 6 months later, I was sitting on the terrace of a small house by the sea in a small seaside town on the East Coast. In front of me lay a stack of manuscripts, the work of members of my literary circle for seniors, which I had organized at the local library. It was the simple, peaceful life I had always dreamed of. The money from the sale of Lawrence's assets provided me with a comfortable existence and the opportunity to finally travel. In those 6 months, I visited Paris, Venice, and Barcelona, places I had read about all my life. I walked the streets described by great writers, sat in the cafes where they created, breathed the same air. And with every step, with every new impression, I felt the invisible thread connecting me to the past being torn apart. There was no news from my family except for rare messages from Fletcher. He wrote about school, the books he was reading, his plans to go to college to study literature. He never mentioned my parents or Priscilla, and I didn't ask. It was our unspoken agreement not to stir up the past. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I reread Lawrence's diary, not out of nostalgia or regret, but to remind myself how important it is to value my own life and not live by someone else's rules. His last will and testament gave me not only financial independence, but also, much more importantly, freedom from the shackles I had created for myself. I often thought about what I would say to him if we had the chance to talk again. Perhaps I would thank him for this last gift, the opportunity to start over. Perhaps I would have told him that I loved him too, despite everything. Or maybe I would have just said goodbye, sincerely and definitively, without resentment or regret. Now, at 67, I finally felt truly alive. I was no longer someone's wife, someone's mother-in-law. I was simply Eleanor Finch, a woman with her own dreams, desires, and plans. A woman who had finally dared to choose herself. The sea roared beneath the terrace, reminding me of endless possibilities. Tomorrow, I was going to start writing my book, a memoir about a life lost and found again, about how it's never too late to start over, about how important it is to be true to yourself, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath of the salty sea air. If she's not there, don't start anything. Now I understood the true meaning of that phrase. Lawrence wasn't talking about physical presence. He was talking about recognition, visibility, the right to have a voice, about the fact that without me, the real me, with my dreams, desires, and right to make my own choices, nothing in this family should continue. And I finally heard him.